This thing called community, an idea dear to all of our hearts, something we all, given our line of work, find necessary for our physical survival, our spiritual survival, the bonds we create with others, the jobs we do to hold them together, not just for our benefit, for the sake of those who are meant to belong, for all of those who can thrive within its boundaries. This thing called community, so essential to the very ideas of our tradition, to the survival of Jews over millennia. This thing called community is held together by the dangerous and maybe even violent activity of drawing boundaries. Communities are in many ways constructed around safety, may feel less present for those of us operating in what we usually feel are fundamentally safe environments. But certainly for much of Jewish history, the construction of community was a means of finding a way of being safe in a context where you could trust the other people to be responsible for your safety, and in which you could offer the possibility of their safety as well. But by definition, constructing communities and building boundaries, and with the language of safety in place, suggests that the whole thing is rooted in some amount of danger, and that the activity of constructing boundaries, which leaves other people on the outside, is inherently something of a violent act. If you have ever been excluded from a community, or if you have ever been a member of a community who has been cut off, where a boundary has been put in place before you, it is not a neutral act. It does not feel like a neutral act. The act of exclusion, even without weapons, can feel violent. And at the same time, if you have ever been responsible for that act of boundary drawing, where your decisions have direct ramifications for the inclusion and the exclusion of others, you should probably be sensitive to, maybe have already become sensitive to, the intense amount of power that you wield over others in that process. The act of inclusion by the powerful and the act of exclusion by the powerful all merely reminds you of what it means to hold power. The whole business of community and boundary making is treacherous. One of the most canonical texts in our tradition, in rabbinic tradition, the text that tells most famously the story of our origin and evolution as a people in a very critical moment, a text that is dear to the heart of what it means to be a rabbinic Jew, a text that has enormous currency at this time of year. My guess is, without having even put it on a source sheet, this might appear on some of your teaching in the next couple of weeks, is the text about the escape of Yochanan ben Zakkai from Jerusalem, a text that I think has been miscategorized for most of our history, treated as a heroic triumph, when in fact it is a tragedy of epic proportions, and maybe even a piece of horror literature. Not just because of the destruction of the temple that follows the story of Yochanan ben Zakkai's escape from Jerusalem, but because of his absolute unwillingness in this text to stand up on behalf of the collective for which he belongs, and to sacrifice them on the altar of his own escape. The text begins, if you have the packet, by reminding us that in Jerusalem, in the year 70 CE, the sectarian divide that we talk about, that we know about so famously, was not merely a set of political distinctions. It certainly was not merely completely different teams of people or clans, but involved profound distinctions between people who were the members of the same families. Abba Sikra was the head of the Zealots in Jerusalem and the son of the sister of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Those who were the inheritors of the legacy of the Pharisees, and those who were the Zealots, who we like to describe in ancient Judaism as like we have 4 different baseball teams, are in fact members of the same family, caught up in a conflict that at times felt like it was existential, and at times, the story reminds us, was the kind of conflict that continues to pervade Jewish history and live within our own families today. Those of us who hold deeply strong beliefs about the Jewish people and our existential threats, and who are related to other Jews who hold equally strong views about the Jewish people and our existential threat in ways that seem to brook no compromise. Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, "Come to me in secret." He came and said to his nephew, "When will you do this? What was Abba Sikra and the Zealots doing but burning the storehouses of food in Jerusalem? Until when will you do this and kill everyone through starvation?" He said, "What am I supposed to do? If I stand up against those who I disagree with in my own camp among the other Zealots, they will kill me." And he said, "I'm going to figure out a way to, show me a way to leave, and I'll try to salvage something." You know a lot of the rest of the story. Yochanan ben Zakkai feigns his death. Death sometimes feels like the only escape from a broken reality. On the way out, the Zealots try to pierce the body. The Zealots try to push the body and are only persuaded by the question of their own reputation. The Romans will think we are the kinds of people who do damage to our own teachers, and instead we'll let him go. You know the negotiation that Yochanan ben Zakkai has with Vespasian, and the sense of prophecy that is supposed to be there. Yochanan ben Zakkai says to Vespasian, "You are the emperor." Of course, he's not quite the emperor yet. They discover while he's there that he is the emperor, and he does what apparently Roman empires and genies do throughout history, which is, "I will now grant you 3 wishes." And at the end of the text, where I want to focus, he says to him, "I'll be going. Vespasian's going to go back to Rome, and I will send somebody else. But before I leave, ask me of something that I can give you." Yochanan ben Zakkai says something unbelievable. "Give me Yavne and its sages. Give me a beach house for me and my friends." The dynasty of Rabban Gamliel, a narrative of a certain type of political authority coming out of the Pharisaic tradition, and doctors to heal Rav Tzadok. Rav Yosef read the following verse around it, but sometimes some say it's Rabbi Akiva. Meshiv chachamim achor v'da'atam yasakel. I am the Lord who turns wise men backwards and makes their knowledge foolish. Ibai lebei marlo, what he should have said to him was, leave the Jews alone this time. The rabbis come up with a salvage. V'hu savar. It's not Yochanan ben Zakkai's words. We're in Aramaic now. V'hu savar, maybe he couldn't do all of that much, and there wouldn't even be a small amount of salvation. Given the opportunity to stand before the Roman emperor, if you want to salvage the legacy of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, he asked for only that which was possible in that moment. Don't judge him for the absolute choice of effectively selling the Jewish people and the temple in Jerusalem down the river. Embrace that what he could get, he got. Now this story is fashioned in relationship to other ancient literatures. Yochanan ben Zakkai's escape from Jerusalem has a lot of similarities to Josephus' escape. It is a story, I'm convinced, together with other Talmud scholars, is forged probably in the 4th century more than the 1st, a time when canons were being created, like the Council of Nicaea. A lot of Yavne sounds like a rabbinic version of that same type of enterprise, including those as the Orthodox and excluding those who are not. We like the story of Yochanan ben Zakkai because of his ingenuity to escape from Jerusalem and to see a better possible future, to disrupt the continuity of Jewish history, which appeared that it was going off the cliff, and be willing to envision something new on the other end. We like that he is seeing around corners, not waiting for the temple to be destroyed, but anticipating the need for a different Judaism on the other end. And as a result, I think we take our eyes off of the destruction itself. We fail to notice that this isn't really a story about the aftermath of destruction. It's a story that makes that destruction palatable. We leave behind the thousands of Jews in Jerusalem who went up in flames. We leave behind that in order to construct his community, to provide his continuity, Yochanan ben Zakkai did not just escape with his rabbi friends, he sacrificed his nephew, maybe his sister. The elevation of the story in our tradition betrays a horrifying choice. Even before we have to, perhaps, this text suggests that we sometimes might be willing to sacrifice our own families and our own communities at the altar of what we perceive to be essential to our own survival. This is what war inevitably does. It sets us against each other. It makes us terrified about our survival and our future. It makes us appeal to those and only those who make us feel safe. And then we begin to draw lines. Then we begin to construct boundaries. And ultimately, we think we have survived intact, and you have to ask, what have we sacrificed along the way? Since this awful war began 21 months ago, this is a story that has been unfolding for Jewish life in North America throughout. With all of us in this room, rabbis, educators, Jewish leaders, caught in the center. The war is not merely between Israel and Hamas, but appears to be between us and us, between us and our children, us and the public narrative. It's a conflict that exists within families and within synagogues, where the boundaries, the boundary making, the construction of teams, us and them, is creating what I would call secondary and tertiary casualties in a conflict that radiates beyond its boundaries. War always does this. War, by necessity, polarizes us. You have to feel, in the midst of a war, especially wars in which the protagonists, both protagonists, the State of Israel and Hamas, are committed to absolute victory. In that context, it inevitably polarizes us, makes us gravitate for the perception of safety with those with whom we can share solidarity. Anyone who brooks some notion of being on the wrong side is not merely wrong, therefore, but might be someone who believes in things that might make me and my kin fundamentally unsafe. Communal boundary making, as I suggested at the beginning, is a violent act no less than we cherish in the story of Yochanan ben Zakkai. We like to see the positive sides, building communities of inclusion and warmth and welcoming. And as hard as you might try to build an expansive community, you will, one point along the way, hit a boundary. You have to. It's incoherent to talk about any sort of community without some sort of boundaries. So some of us stipulate the boundaries at the outset, and those, almost by definition, are going to be smaller communities, and others discover the boundaries along the way. In peacetime, that might be an activity we can do in which we mitigate some of the violence. In wartime, it feels impossible. Sometimes the activity of boundary drawing, of boundary making, is so successful in its violence that it becomes irreversible. I can only imagine, and I invite you and your chavruta to consider where and when you have seen that over the past 21 months. The feeling of the rupture between individuals and the communities to which they once belonged now feel irreversible. To notice the pain, what that does for them, what it means for you. When we fail at constructing boundaries, when they are reversible, we sheepishly tend our wounds, we tend to each other, we figure out a way to make it work. I'm not convinced that all of the boundary drawing that's happened over the last couple of years is permanent. I'm not sure all of it isn't reversible. I'm quite sure we're going to have to find a way to think about community in ways that acknowledge the complexity of interpersonal relationships, that we have to figure out a way as a Jewish community to not allow the template of the sectarianism in the past to be a model for how we think about our future. That's what we're going to work on today. In your sources, the next section that's in the materials here describes rabbinic interpretations of 3 essential biblical texts, all of which entail immense violence in the act of boundary making and in the forging of the Eidah, the Kahal, the people Israel in the wilderness. They are the stories of Korach and his rebellion against Moshe and Moshe's leadership. It is a story of Pinḥas, this week's Parsha. If any of you are sermoning this week, you're welcome. Pinḥas in this week's Parsha, who responds to a boundary violation between the Israelites and the Midianites by stipulating that boundary very clearly and very violently. And the story in Leviticus 14 about the conflict between 2 Israelites who have different ethnic identities in the camp of Israel, one of whom is described as Ben Ha'isha Ha'Yisraelit, the son of the Israelite woman, implying, as the rabbis will unpack, that he does not have an Israelite father. I want you to focus on what the rabbis do in an incredible subversion of all of these stories of boundary making. I want you to notice, and I invite you to use your Sepharias, or actual Sfarim if you have them, to look back at the Tanakh text to give you a sense of what's happening in that core story, but to dwell most of the time on the rabbinic explication of these stories, and to notice all of the ways in which the rabbis seem invested in turning stories of absolute boundary making at the periphery of community into stories of blurring those boundaries. What are they doing? What are they scared of in the stories of the Ben Ha'isha Yisraelit and Korach and in Pinḥas? How might that help us think differently about the activity of boundary making and establishing of community when we are not the Israelites in the wilderness, but we are leaders of communities elsewhere? And the second thing I want you to consider, if you have time, is where do we start looking for an antidote, for a model of thinking about community that is not inherently rooted in the violence and language of safety that comes with this business of boundary making. And we're going to talk about the idea of community as rooted in consent. In consent. And that's what we have in sources 5, 6, and 7. If you spend all of your time in sources 2, 3, and 4, that's okay. There's what to do there. And we'll be back here at 11 o'clock. Thank you. I'm sure it's true also for my colleagues here at the Institute who've been teaching in these programs, this program this week, and in our programs, usually there are many more of them that take place over the course of the summer. I'm sure it's true for them as well, but it's always true for me, which is I prepare to teach on issues and on questions that I think matter to the rabbis and the other learners and educators who come here. But I also know that I'm working stuff out for myself, that I use these as an opportunity to sometimes teach the Torah that I feel I need to hear. I think it's probably true whenever you teach a class, not always, whenever you give a sermon, that sometimes the audience is others, and sometimes the audience is yourself. Early in the war, back in November of 2023, I wrote a piece in the foreword about the political shifts underway in the Jewish community in North America. The perception that I had at the time, I think some data bore it out, about what was called the surge. It remains to be seen whether the surge was a permanent move, a permanent shift of folks who had been disconnected to Jewish life and felt the pull of Jewish peoplehood back into Jewish institutional spaces not necessarily into Jewish institutional spaces, but into a sense of commitment and passion or a concern for the Jewish people that had been dormant for a while. We saw this in the largest gathering of American Jews in history in November in 2023 in Washington, which was also made up by a whole variety of institutions who may have been on the fence about the extent to which they wanted to come together in that kind of literal manifestation of a kind of big tent, an issue that has been a notion or an idea that's been eroding in Jewish life for so long, and at the same time observed a kind of stepping out of the tent by a number of institutions on the Jewish left, signaling through their rhetoric, through their actions, through things they were publishing, that they were standing in express opposition to the normative values of Jewish peoplehood as expressed through a relationship to the state of Israel and the Jewish people, deciding to position themselves in a very different way than they had been before. I observed and tried to notice that this represented an opportunity for the Jewish community to actually expand our boundaries. That sometimes when people mark themselves out of the camp, it actually makes it a lot easier for those who are on the inside to actually think more expansively. Actually, it's the anxiety of sorting out who is in and who is out that sometimes makes us more conservative, more anxious, more protective. And when those who are on the fence decide to no longer remain part of a collective, it makes it possible for those who remain to think about those boundaries less and to focus on what it actually means to be inside. I tried to insist that in conducting a public conversation in that piece about the iteration or the appearance of significant boundaries in Jewish life, that the claims that I was making were not just because they were not just descriptive, they were also normative. I tried to insist in that piece that this wasn't personal. It wasn't really about individuals. It had a lot more to do with institutions. I'll say as a footnote, I think we way too often personalize our memberships with institutions and then take as personal critique of institutions, when in fact we know that our commitments are far more complex than the institutions to which we belong. Those are oftentimes provisional loyalties, and we contain multitudes. And nevertheless, that article was widely interpreted by folks who felt alienated by it as fundamentally anti-pluralistic, as about an activity of boundary drawing rather than boundary expansion. Throughout the war, our institution, like virtually all in the Jewish community, has been tested by boundary questions. Claims that people make in fits of passion as they experience enormous amounts of fear, risks to their real or perceived safety, both here in Israel and in North America, desperate to articulate moral positions that help them make sense of the world, and worry about how those expressions of the people who work down the hall from them, the Facebook posts, the Twitter posts of colleagues and friends, whether that enables them to feel part of the same institution. Since writing that piece in 2023, I have learned and felt a lot more about the power that comes with the activity of boundary setting, especially when it comes from positions of power, and in some ways, the fear involved in engaging in that activity. I've noticed the gap, which I understood between the diagnostic and the prescriptive, is not actually experienced that way by those who feel that they're being set outwards. I've thought a lot about the human beings caught because of the complexity of their own commitments, even their ambivalence and their confusion, caught in the middle of whenever boundary-making activities take place. I've recognized the incapacity for boundary drawing to come without costs. I'm not sure I was wrong, descriptively. I'm not sure it's not an activity that Jewish communities have to engage with. At a certain point, as I said at the beginning of this talk, there's no such thing as a community that has no boundaries, and there are going to be moments when those boundaries need to be stipulated. Those boundaries are going to be tested at all times, by sometimes in good faith, by people desperate to be in the inside, but anxious that they will have to compromise themselves to participate, and sometimes in bad faith. We have to do this work. And at the same time, we have to listen for the immense human cost that happens when we treat these processes as though they are mechanical and technical, when they are, in fact, fundamentally human. We know why we draw boundaries. We do so for our sense of safety. We do so based in fear. We also do so out of a sense of righteousness. I am building something. I care about something. I need to therefore protect this thing that I'm trying to build from being torn down by those who might come into my midst and do things to my commitments that will prevent them from being actualized. It's done, this activity of boundary making is oftentimes done by those who are on the inside, moving inwards, pushing other people out. It's oftentimes done equally by those on the outside, on the margins, who extract themselves out of community and build their own version of solidarity. That's why I started with the Yochanan ben Zakkai story. We, who inherit that story, think of Yochanan ben Zakkai as the mainstream surviving in a moment when everyone else was morally deficient. What if it is Yochanan ben Zakkai as the marginal character, building solidarity and rejecting the legitimacy of the vast majority of Jews who go up in flames? I give you 3 texts to look at, which in my view share in common a kind of undermining of the temptation to think that the biblical stories of Korach and Pinḥas and the son of the Israelite woman, to think of those stories, all of which are rooted in violence, as in any way useful templates for those of us who do not operate within the conditions of divine providence in the wilderness, to be able to emulate them. It's fascinating to me how many people read Korach and Pinḥas self-righteously, who admire the righteousness of Pinchas's courage, who stands in the breach in a moment of boundary violation, when the Israelites are drawn to the idolatry and to the lust that breaks down the boundary between them and their neighbors, who stands up in that moment and reiterates the boundary through a violent act that reminds the people Israel of where they begin and others end, and that enables the possibility for God to then play out the rest of that division through plague. What does it mean to emulate, to use as a template the story of Pinḥas? What does it mean to emulate or use as a template the story of Korach, who together with other members of his assembly come up with an argument that might be plausible from the standpoint of the critique of Moses and his isolated activity of leadership? Keep in mind, Korach is not the first person to come along and tell Moses that he has a kind of narcissistic orientation towards what it means to lead the Israelite people. In some cases, aka his father-in-law, it's good advice. In other cases, and he may be right, the argument appears to undermine the legitimacy of his own authority and, more importantly, God's authority, and this has to be remedied by a promise, Moses' act of faith in God, that God will make clear to the Israelites who is ultimately now part of the leadership and who is not. It's an immense act of faith. If you read the text, Moses tells them what's going to happen before he's even consulted with God, and God backs that up. What does it mean to read Korach, too, as a template for how leaders might respond to threats to their authority that take place in the context of the people Israel. As I hope you noticed in reading these texts, in both cases, both the story of Korach and the story of Pinḥas are slowly undermined through the process of rabbinic interpretation. In the Korach text, Sanhedrin 109b, the first case that is offered is the case of the Meraglim, the spies. And in this case, there's no contest. The spies have no share in the world to come. Rabbis oftentimes use the phrase, they have no share in the world to come, I think as a way of testing out the idea of thinking about our own certainty. We don't really know. We are not entitled. We are not the ones who adjudicate whether anyone has a share in the world to come. I can't really decide whether ultimately these people are condemned by God. It is my imaginative activity to say, I know exactly what happens to these people in the future. The spies have no share in the world to come. But if you notice right away, we could talk about that. If you notice right away, they turn to Korach. The members of the assembly of Korach have no share in the world to come. As it is stated, the earth closed upon them, meaning in this world, and they perished from among the assembly, meaning in the world to come. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. Since I have two different expressions in the Bible that signal their punishment, one must be this world and one must be permanent. The rupture, the sectarianism, the break with the people Israel that took place for the people of Korach was not merely responded to with the death penalty, it was responded to with the ultimate condemnation that they have exited from the people Israel. But Rabbi Eliezer reads it differently. Alehem omer hakatuv, Hashem memit umchayeh morid sheol vaya'al. God may condemn people down to Sheol. This is a pretty good use of what's going on in the text. After all, the earth opens up. They collapse into the earth. But God brings them back up. Why is Rabbi Eliezer trying to salvage Korach? Maybe Rabbi Eliezer is instructing us that the activity of violent boundary assertion that sometimes has to take place in a moment where a community and its leadership is threatened can only be justified through the framework of hora'at sha'ah, something that is taught for a particular moment that is not supposed to be precedent. This is a very important characteristic of rabbinic leadership. Sometimes you establish precedent by doing something even radical that you are using in order to change realities and you anticipate will be replicated in the future. But maybe what the rabbis want us to do is to think of the story of Korach not as a template for how we are meant to respond to the erosion of our authority in the moment, but something exceptional that happened one time out of necessity. And the way that I demonstrate it is I insist that ultimately the people connected to Korach and his threat to the authority of Moses are rehabilitatable. Under different conditions, a different version of the people of Korach, maybe this would not have been the inevitable way to respond to them. This becomes clearer as we go through the Gemara. I give another example of what it means to not have a share in the world to come, quoting Rabbi Akiva, but I get a different version of Rabbi Eliezer's position expressed by Yehuda ben Betera, who says they are like a lost item that is sought. Right? I've gone astray like a lost sheep. Seek out your servant, for I do not forget your mitzvot. This is now the introduction of empathy. You hear it in Chazal. They're not saying that the people of Korach were correct, but they were lost. What is the difference between a contest to the authority that threatens the boundaries of community by claiming that someone who's doing something is malicious versus somebody who's doing something in which they are lost? You can hear the pastoral invitation to all of us to respond differently to the threats to our own authority, to respond differently to the boundary transgressions of our community when you think of people as being inherently wrong, maliciously wrong, versus people who are confused. By the way, this can be very condescending. You're not wrong, you're just confused. I wouldn't recommend saying this out loud. But what it means as a virtue ethic for leadership is that your orientation towards people who you think are malicious versus your orientation to people who you think are ignorant or lost or confused will be fundamentally different. One of them is an invitation to violence. The other is an invitation to compassion. The rabbis take this further. Vayikach Korach shelakach mekach ra la'atzmo. He made a bad deal for himself. Again, you see the erosion of the magnitude of Korach's heresy in the camp of Israel when it's turned into he miscalculated. He was trying to do something, and instead he wound up acquiring a death sentence that couldn't be reversed. Korach shena'asa karcha b'Yisrael. Korach wound up creating a void in Israel. I want to read this text ambitiously. Actually, Korach's mistake cost all of us. It's a totally different story to read the Korach story as like, great, I had a threat to the boundaries and to the authority of the people Israel. It's now been erased miraculously. Those people disappear, and they wind up in this phrase that people love to use about their opponents, right? They wound up on the wrong side of history. They're lost to the future. Nobody remembers them. And actually, instead, Chazal is suggesting that this failure left a void in the people of Israel. There was something wrong with our collective as a result of this. They were missing. There was a halal, like a hole, in the midst of our people. And then finally, the most remarkable piece of this is this last piece of text. Moshe arose and went to Datan ve'Aviram. Reish Lakish says, Amar Reish Lakish mikan she'ein machzikin b'machloket. We learn from this, and what are they learning from? The fact that Moshe, who was threatened by their authority, did not sit around and wait for them to come apologize. Moshe was mochel on his own kavod, even though he was the one who was being threatened. He was forgiving of his own honor and his own authority to go pursue a resolution with Datan ve'Aviram, to Amarav kol ha'machazik b'machloket over belav. Right? Shenemar v'lo yiheh kekorach ve'adato. Any person who persists in conflict is violating this kind of precept. And what have they now done? By saying people should not be like Korach ve'adato, that includes Moshe. Moshe signaled that the ultimate way in which he was unlike Korach is that instead of standing in opposition to those who he disagreed with, Moshe tried to pursue a resolution together with even those who were threatening his own authority. Unbelievably, the rabbis take a text that is perhaps the most straightforward in terms of boundary creation around authority, and they undermine it completely. It becomes a lesson about the pain of the Korach story. It becomes a lesson about the possibility of repentance even in moments of rupture. It becomes an invitation for leaders to be the responsible adults, to look at those who contest our authority and respond to them by saying, what might I do differently to keep you within the Machaneh Yisrael? What might I do differently to prevent the possibility, the devastating scenario that your exit will create a void among our people? Instead of the protective impulse of what might I do to ensure the safety of those in the camp against those who would threaten it, what might I do to recognize that what you are doing may threaten all of us in ways that demand of me to make repair? The second text that I asked you to look at, the story of Pinḥas. Again, a boundary-making moment. And there's a lot that the rabbis have to say about Pinḥas. But I picked two pieces of this Gemara, also in Sanhedrin, in which the rabbis suggest another way in which Pinḥas represents, at best, hora'at sha'ah, an instruction that can only be functional in the moment in which it was given, and they work very hard to make sure that none of us think that Pinḥas is a template. This is such a dangerous text, the Pinḥas story. The fact that it's available to us, this act of zealous obedience of God's will. If you go back and read prior to the actual story of Pinḥas, the instructions that Moses had given to the Israelite leaders was to actually impale all of the leaders of this revolt against Moshe, impale them on spears, hokah, right? Put them on spears. And then Pinḥas comes through and in the moment of passion, impales them on a spear. We tend to think of Pinḥas as doing a kind of radical, violent act, but what he really was doing was just the only person who was actually listening to the instructions. Nevertheless, the rabbis say, "V'lo od she'elim peresh Zimri v'harago Pinḥas." If Zimri had separated from Cosbi just the instant before, neherag alav, Pinḥas would be chayav mitah. Pinḥas would be subject to the death penalty. Nehapach Zimri v'harago Pinḥas. If Zimri had actually turned around and killed Pinḥas, ein neherag alav shaharei rodefu. Pinḥas, he would not have been liable for the killing of Pinḥas because he is a pursuer. It's a pursuer who you are allowed to kill to prevent them from killing. Pinḥas turns from being a hero of the story to a dangerous zealot who the rabbis are scared of us emulating. The rabbis go further. Amar Rav Yochanan, Shisha nisim na'asu lo lePinḥas. Pinḥas had 6 miracles performed for them. One is that Zimri didn't separate and could have. Echad hayalo daber v'lo diber. Somebody could have spoken and interrupted this. Another is that he aimed the spear so correctly that it wound up piercing the genitals of all Zimri and Cosbi, which enabled him to demonstrate to the people of Israel outside the camp that they were in flagrante delicto as this happened. One is that they didn't fall off the spear as he walked out. One is that an angel came and raised the lintel, and another is the angel came and created destruction among the people. As the Israelites are engaged in a boundary transaction, in the blurriness of this moment, Pinḥas's violent acts that reiterate the boundary are viewed by the rabbis as something not to admire but to fear. Good luck. You want to be a kind of violent leader who can reiterate the boundaries between Israelites and others? We strongly recommend that unless you are certain that 6 miracles are going to transpire at that moment, right, that this is something that otherwise you then become liable in the death penalty. It's striking to me, as every time I read the Pinḥas story, I think about the ways in which some of the people who are who make the boldest claim that they love the Jewish people, some of the people who are most passionate about Jewish peoplehood, act in such violent ways to other Jews. It feels like a strange thing to love the Jewish people, but to respond to that, protecting and defending the honor of the Jewish people by trying to push out those who you think don't love the Jewish people enough. That always feels kind of confusing to me. What does it mean to actually be so scared of the zealotry of Pinḥas that you tolerate boundary blurriness, right, instead of trying to reiterate it? Because that, too, is a means of expressing love and compassion for all of those who are part of your people. And the third text I want to ask you to consider here is this extraordinary little Midrash from the Sifra in Emor. I want to say B'Shem Omro. I learned this with my friend and teacher, Rabbi Ethan Tucker. The son of the Israelite woman goes out. The text actually tells us that he's the son of an Israelite woman and the son of an Egyptian man in the midst of the children of Israel. He is a boundary crosser. The rabbis will clarify what that means. So where did he go out? Mi Beit Dino shel Moshe. Shebali ta'o alo betoch machane Dan. He goes to plant his tent within the campment of the Dan people. And they said, "What business do you have planting your tent here?" He said, "Mi benot Danani. I am the son of a woman from the tribe of Dan." They said to him in turn, "Isht al diglo beotot levet avotam yichanu b'nei Yisrael." In other words, this is a patrilineal line. You are not part of the Dan people. You don't get to pitch your tent in our camp. And the problem that is created for this person is that means, based on the perfectly ordered system of how the Israelites camp their tents in the wilderness, that there is no place for him to park his tent. What does a person do who, by not ideological terms, but simply because of the accident of his own ethnicity, has no place within the people Israel? This is the first clue in this text that despite the fact that the primary reason why this text exists in the Torah is to clarify what's supposed to happen when a person curses God, and secondly, the other reason why this is in the Torah, to make clear that the rules that apply around cursing God apply to both the ger and the ezrach. It includes both those who are part of the people Israel, as well as those attached to the people Israel. You're not allowed to curse God. It's not one of those things where, like, if you're not an Israelite, you don't have to eat kosher. You're allowed to eat treif, right? There's a whole set of rules. Give it to that guy. The lotases, including the particular case of cursing God, apply equally to whether you are a citizen or a stranger. That's the halachic purpose of this text in the Torah. But the rabbis now seem invested in demonstrating that actually the primary injustice perpetrated in the text was perpetrated towards this individual. It almost is like, I don't want to say they're giving justification or permission for his decision to ultimately curse God in this moment, but they are seeming to indicate that the activity of boundary making as being done by the Israelites put this person in such a vulnerable position that they had nothing left to do. He comes out of the camp of Moshe. Nichnas lebeit tino shel Moshe. He runs to Moshe. He says, help me. What he's begging for is, find me a place in the camp. Begging. Find me a place in the camp. And the ultimate indictment of the text, Yatza mechuyav ve'amad ve'gidef. He was found liable for positioning himself in the camp of Dan, despite the fact that he actually had nowhere to go. And it was that point that he cursed. Right? Vehu ben ish bitzri af al pi shelo hayu mamzerim be'oto shah, hu haya kemamzer. There were no rules quite yet around illegitimate children, but he was kimamzer in the sense that by no fault of his own. Mamzerut is a choice of parentage. By no fault of his own, he has no place within the Machaneh Yisrael, and nevertheless, nit gayer. He had converted to become part of the people Israel. There's no way to understand this text as other than an indictment that communities that are policing the boundaries of identity in this way are actually exclusionary, almost by definition, to those who perfectly have the rights of belonging, but who, for whatever circumstances, don't seem to fit. I find this to be a kind of extraordinary undermining of the clarity of the biblical text itself. Ethan points out that this phrase that is used to curse God here is a very strange word, vayikov. He punctured. What does it mean to puncture God's name? But rather, he offers, I think he's quoting Milgram perhaps, or paraphrasing Milgram, vayikov may be, he punctures the camp of Israel. He punctures the myth of a camp of Israel. He demonstrates this doesn't really work. I would go one step further, is that he punctures the dangerous myth of intactness that communities hold about themselves, despite the fact that not everybody fits. That myth of intactness is exclusionary. It is even violent, and in this case, it leads to violence. The person who stands up and says, this is unjust, I have no place here, is ultimately murdered by the camp of Israel when they take out stones and stone him. I'd like to think that maybe this text is about puncturing the self-satisfaction that comes with establishing clear lines of belonging. What all three of these texts share in common, I think, is that in God's world, the world of the Bible, there is a construct of perfect justice that makes for boundaries to be permanent. In all three of these texts, God is the force in the story who asserts the cleanness of the boundaries between the people Israel and those who would come to threaten it. Zimri, Korach, the Ben Ha'isha Ha'Yisraelit. God can do that. And what the rabbis are doing in turn is admitting, or maybe arguing, that they lack the confidence, the clarity, the permanence, or the perfection of God's justice. They recognize that they are alone. We are alone in policing boundaries. And here's the great irony. We are alone in policing these boundaries without the benefit of God's certainty. And we are oftentimes as or more violent in the expression of these boundaries as God is in the story. Maybe that's why we read these texts with maybe some attraction to them. Have you ever had some dark moment of hoping that those who threaten the intactness of your community, maybe just the earth will open up and they will be swallowed up? Not literally, but they will exit and it'll make it easier for us. I think the rabbis are suggesting that those who would do like God did to Korach, or like God rewarded Pinḥas, or like the injustices of the book of Leviticus, are appropriating to themselves a certainty that only belongs to God. And of course, these boundaries, the desire for these clear boundaries, are so understandable. In fact, absent God's system of constructing the perfect set of circumstances for the Israelite people in the wilderness, we become desperate for something that looks similar. How easy would it be to lead a community, to lead a people in which we were not threatened physically, materially, in terms of our own authority, by those at the gates? It becomes more urgent for us to act as the responsible parties in this moment, as dangerous as that activity might be. What do we do then? How might we think about community if it is not through the certainty and the violence that is imagined by Korach, Pinḥas, and the book of Leviticus? How do the rabbis help us think about a model for thinking of community that recognizes the fundamental limitations of human power, that recognizes the appeal that exists within our souls for the certainty of the story here, that acknowledges the risks of violence inherent in a system of policing boundaries? What do we do? What is the framework for understanding community if it's meant to be stripped of self-righteousness? And here I think the idea that I want to play with is about consent. The notion that to belong to a community involves a constant, chronic, and repetitive activity of opting in. What happens when all of us think of community in that framework? Needless to say, this is not come back to that. Bavli Shabbat is a famous text, the ultimate kind of theory of consent that the rabbis offer about what it means to belong to the covenant. Vayityatzru b'tachtit har, they stood at the foot of the mountain. It's a very beautiful, suggestive little reading. It, of course, can logically mean the foot of the mountain, but tachtit implies that they're actually underneath the mountain. Amar Rav Dimi Abraham Barachasa Melamed Shekafa Kadosh Baruch Hu Alehem Et Har Kigigit. God overturned the mountain on them like a tub. Ve'amar Lahem Im Atem Mekablim Torah Mutav V'im Lav Sham Te'eg Gvuratchem. Great, take the Torah, and if not, you'll be buried there. Amar Acha Bar Yaakov Mikan Moda'ara Ba'le Oraita. This is bad news for the Torah. This suggests that the covenant is entirely rooted in coercion. And in contrast, Rava comes along to answer the question. Hadur kablu b'imei Achashverosh shichtiv kimu v'kiblu hayudim kimu ma shekiblu kvar. This gets rectified in the book of Esther. This is a good trick. Kimu v'kiblu, echoing the same language in the Bible. They accepted the edicts of Esther, that is, that which was sent out establishing a new holiday previously not existing in the Torah. So the very act of the Jewish people accepting upon them mitzvot that didn't exist beforehand is a means of signaling they were accepting amendments, and in that process, accepting the original document as well. If you're accepting all of this, you're accepting the whole package. But what does this text, of course, have in common with the same move that the rabbis are making about Korach and Sefer Vayikra and Pinḥas? That the fact that Esther operates in a context without divine providence, how hard does the book of Esther try to eliminate God's presence in the story? So hard, in fact, that we have other ancient versions of the book of Esther, including the version in Greek, in which God is a very powerful figure in the story, makes the book of Esther, Greek Esther, makes the book read like a regular book of Tanakh. It starts with a prophecy that is given to Mordechai that this is going to happen, and then Esther prays not arbitrarily like she does now. I'll pray to whom? The text never tells us. Prays, in fact, to God. God intervenes and helps the Israelites. That's a normal Jewish story. Esther works unbelievably hard to make this a story that is not about divine presence and divine providence, and therefore, the opting in to this narrative of consent into the covenant is intended to be an anthropocentric story. This is how we construct belonging in a period of time when it is not defined by us, by someone else. This is how we make it work. We create environments, and I think the text means to tell us that the act of kimu v'kiblu was not a historical condition entirely, but it is a chronic condition in the present. This is why the political theorist Daniel Elazar describes Jewish life, modern Jewish life, as a dance between kinship and consent. At any given time, we have myths of kinship as shaping and defining who belongs to our community. But the real characteristic at every turn is whether we are opting in to the very communities that would make a claim on us. Communal leaders, Jewish life, communal leaders know this more than anything else. I heard years ago from a rabbi, this goes back about 15 years, who said every year around high holiday time, he gets back the membership letter that they mailed out for renewal. You know that letter. It's probably going out now or went out already. Probably went out already. He gets mailed back the letter, not a separate piece of paper. Written on the letter says, we no longer require the services of the congregation. Now we know what that means. That means the kids had been b'nai mitzvah or confirmed. It means that we have no intention of having marriages again in our family. We'll hold out till we die, and you'll probably come do the funeral anyway, right? I no longer require the services of the congregation. And this rabbi described to me as the feeling of failure when that letter comes, because what the rabbi had understood to be a covenantal bond of relationship turned out to be a transactional relationship of needs. And it is a reminder then, that's the sad reminder of what actually constructs community for most of us at any given time is a constant, if oftentimes not fully articulated, process of consenting over and over again. I have this beautiful text by a law professor, Heidi Hurd, from, I believe, the University of Illinois, who describes consent as moral magic. By sheer force of will, we bring into existence things that have never existed before. With but a nod, we effect the disappearance of things that have long served as barriers to the actions of others. By mere resolve, we generate things that pose significant obstacles to others' exercise of liberty. What's the nature of these things? We create and destroy by our mere decision to do so. I love how she's dancing with the theological power that human beings have. What is the creative power that all of us have over others? The answer, the rights and obligations of others. By what seemingly magical means do we alter these rights and obligations? By making promises and issuing or revoking consent. When we decide to create something, It has constraints on the rights of others and the rights of self. When I choose to belong, it obligates me. When I choose to establish the boundaries of a community, it is going to impede the rights of others, and it is going to impose upon them obligations. There's a beautiful possibility for using this as a way of thinking about the activity of constructing community, a way of reminding us that the pre-existing condition that the Bible imagines, that there is this unpunctured thing called our community, or Knesset Yisrael, or the Jewish people, and then the Bible is repelling all of those threats to the unpunctured thing. The rabbis are instead, and now Heidi Hurd, helping us understand that there is no unpunctured thing called community. All there is at any given point, groups of people deciding through the moral magic of consent to constitute communities or to pull them apart. That is everything. Now the risk, obviously, if you read Heidi Hurd as a leader, is that moral magic of consent, if you're the person in charge of the boundary making, that is a powerful thing and it can go to your head. That's where the warnings of rabbinic self-righteousness about those who would emulate the Korachs and the Pinḥas is coming in to warn us. You are capable of doing something very powerful through the mechanics of inclusion and exclusion. Be very, very careful with that power. And if we recognize that this is happening all the time, that we, through our actions, constructing community, including and excluding others, and that they are at all times trying to figure out how they belong and when they leave, that maybe, as opposed to feeling anxious and threatened by this, and I want to acknowledge it is okay to feel anxious and threatened by this. I feel it all the time. Who are we, the community? How do we make up a community when we hold such different ideas, ideas that feel like they threaten each other, ideas that feel incompatible, that maybe that very activity of recognizing the power of consent that we hold and that others hold makes us awake to the recognition of fundamental human limitations that we hold and that other holds. It reminds us of the Rawls idea of the fact of pluralism, that other human beings are just, they're there and they make claims on us, that every act of the constructing of community, maybe even the existence of community of itself, is not merely magical, but it is miraculous. When I think of the flip of that narrative, we fear so much losing the communities that we hold because we think of them as default things that exist in the world that can be ruptured based on the misbehaviors of others. What happens instead when we name that when community works, it's a miracle? That the default is that it's impossible. The default is that it doesn't really work. Maybe do we feel less threatened then when it fails? If we remember those moments of the magical and the miraculous. I'll give you two last texts to consider. Gideon Bohak has this great essay about the Second Temple in antiquity that stuck with me for a long time. What it meant for the ancient Jews to basically have one temple. Actually quite different than most ancient religions. So what did it mean for the polity of the people of Israel to have one temple? And he names, and this is the reason I really love it, is because I don't know anything about science, but I like using science for metaphors, and apparently so does Gideon Bohak. He names that the temple had centripetal and centrifugal qualities in antiquity. It has centripetal qualities in being a magnet for philanthropy and for travel to the land of Israel and for prayer. Everybody directed their energy towards this place. And it had centrifugal qualities at the same time, meaning that it generated so much passion at its center that it was the one thing that spun people out. Some people got so mad at the activities of the temple that they ran into the wilderness and started a library. Other people got so mad at the actions of the priests in the temple that they did things like is described for Yochanan ben Zakkai, escaping the city to reconstitute Judaism elsewhere. The temple held this power at the center of Jewish existence, and it helps us to understand, if you want to stick with the physics metaphor, that when you have something that exerts so much power over a people at a particular time, that the explosion of that center creates a black hole. A little bit of the story of what happens for 2,000 years in diaspora, where we are floating as like independent entities forced to imagine a relationship of Jewish peoplehood with one another, even though there is no center of gravity to hold us together. And every time I think about this, I think about the way that the state of Israel today exercises such powerful centripetal and centrifugal effects on Jewish community and consciousness. That is what is happening to us. It is so powerfully the center of gravity of what seems to constitute Jewish life that it is the thing that we in the diaspora fight about the most. You see the magnetism that you all feel by coming here, to be here. How many of you felt like your skin crawling when we sent out that email saying RTS was canceled, or not yet, or hold on to it, right? It's like your skin crawls, I gotta come. And then you come and you're angry. These things are connected. They are part of what it means to have this kind of center of gravity. And we notice that when that lives in the world, together with this impossible task of trying to construct the magical and mysterious building of community, it helps us understand this discomfort. Malila, I heard reference this text as well from Sota, this text of one of the early ruptures that the rabbis imagined of what led to the ultimate destruction of the temple. And once again, we are back in family kinship relationships. The brothers, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, this is one of the weird places in the Gemara where the rabbis seem to actually know the history. This is true. Those were the two brothers who ultimately allowed the collapse of what had been the Hasmonean rule and invited the Romans in. When the two brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, were fighting with each other. One of them was outside the city, one was inside the city. And what they would do is they would send down the group on the inside. If you were running the temple, but you were exclusively locked on the inside and being besieged on the outside, you didn't have livestock, because you keep the livestock outside the city. So they would drop down coins and they would send up animals. And think about how both absurd and beautiful this is. They are at war with each other, but they are both invested in the perpetuation of the temple. By the way, as good of a summary of the state of the Jewish people as we have. Obsession with the preservation of something at the center, but so profound that we are both holding it together and keeping it alive and going to war against one another at the same time. There was a certain sage there, conversant in Greek wisdom. This is a good polemic against Greek wisdom. He spoke to them in that vernacular and said, by the way, guys, bad news. You're not going to win so long as they continue the temple service. The next day they sent down coins in a bank box. They sent up to them a pig. When it reached the midpoint of the wall, it stuck its nails into the wall, and the land of Israel trembled for 400 parsot. An immense earthquake takes place in the land of Israel, an earthquake that is meant to anticipate the destruction of the temple, an earthquake that shows up also in the New Testament. When Jesus is crucified, there's an earthquake in the land of Israel. There probably was an earthquake in the land of Israel in the 1st century CE, which everybody in antiquity understood prophetically, in retrospect, as the earthquake that was going to signal the ultimate destruction. So what happens? This core value sits at the center. That very thing that we share divides us, and the result of that division is a willingness to destroy that thing we hold at the center as opposed to preserve it. The real risk in the communities that we hold, and I can't help but think about the ways in which the divisions that we have around Israel and the Jewish community in the diaspora, more often than not, betray the same passion for this thing we hold in common. It betrays the same passion. and it fulminates with anger that drives us towards one another. We are Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. One instinct that our tradition offers us through the biblical texts is the alternative of the kind of zealotry and certainty that we use to push out those who resist us. And maybe, there are essential moments when it has to happen. Every community leader does have to establish boundaries. Those moments that I described as hora'at sha'ah, they are inevitable consequences of feeling that something is threatened. But maybe there are habits of mind, of spirit, or even process that could help us think about community not always as something that we are preserving and protecting, but community across difference as something that we are constantly, chronically building. Something that is just magical and miraculous when it actually works. Sometimes I have a part of my musar over watching 2 years of people saying things that I think are wrong. Have you had that experience? Never, right? I've gotten into a musar practice of, Yehuda, you don't hate that person. You just think they're wrong. You don't. And actually, you oftentimes hold to the same things, the same passions for something that they do, and it is going to take immense fortitude to remind ourselves of what it looks like to be the kinds of people who are mekaimim umekablim, accepting, consenting to the building of community in spite of what feel like the obvious alternatives. I want us to try to imagine that community. Thank you. Yeah, Suzanne. I think there's a mic coming around.
I just have a clarifying question. I don't understand
Why
why the pig came.
the pig?
Yeah. I mean, what about the three? Wait,
Yeah.
there we go. I just have a clarifying question.
Yeah.
Like, I don't get why the pig ended up coming up after the Greek guy said what he said.
Yeah.
Not a deep question.
I mean, I strongly recommend the Simpsons clip about Spider Pig. That's what I think about whenever I read this text. No, the real answer is basically it's if you keep sending down money and you keep sending up animals when they send down money, then they offer it at the temple, and God is not going to intervene on one side or the other because they're actually weirdly tethered to each other. They're dependent on each other. So when they send down the money, instead they send up a treif animal. They send up a pig that would violate the temple. It's a means of kind of it's a choice to prioritize political survival over spiritual survival. And the real version of this text, what it's masking, is that what ultimately those on the outs, the real resolution to the Aristobulus Hyrcanus divide was that one side in history said, I can't beat them on my own. I'm going to create an alliance with the Roman Empire. And that's when Pompey marches into Jerusalem. Spoiler, you don't make alliances with the Roman Empire. You turn over sovereignty. So this story of the pig is a way of describing the unholy alliance that one Jew makes with the Roman Empire over the other, which they think is in the interest of their political victory, but ultimately results in the spiritual catastrophe of Jerusalem. I saw you in the back, yeah.
I have a question that I'm sure you've thought about, so this is not really pushing back. It's something that came up in our chavruta. I suspect that one of the things that I find so powerful about the rabbinic sources is I think they speak by and large to a community that presumed their boundaries were relatively stable and probably needed to hear dafka that in those rare cases where the boundary needs to be more permeable, we have to find a way to negotiate that. I suspect that, like, for most Jews living in the diaspora outside the Haredi world, it's actually the opposite problem. Like, the presumption is that Jewish boundaries are almost completely permeable. And I wonder if communities today in the diaspora actually need to hear the opposite thing, which is that you think your boundaries are so permeable and you think you have choice in the matter, which you've had, like, since the Enlightenment, but actually you really don't. And I think one of the things, the last thing that I'm thinking about all of this, especially since October 7th, and this was described in a variety of ways, like A.B. Yoshua used to say that the difference between Israeli Jews and American Jews is that his Judaism is skin and ours is clothing, which I think some American Jews didn't like to hear so much. I actually think it's a very compelling point. But I think one of the things that a lot of American Jews experienced, particularly Jews, unlike everyone in this room who weren't, like, super involved, was that their Jewish identity was actually much more skin than they had realized. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious about whether you think these texts are really relevant, or how you think about that, and like how relevant you think these texts are to, like,
Okay.
our kind of communities.
Very. Look, I'm very sensitive to the ways in which years ago in this Beit Midrash, I did a shiur on American Jewish identity and about the tension in our tradition between identity as an ontological thing, something that you have that you can't shake, the stain of an identity, using the skin is one term, versus identity as a matter of choice, and that is part of the whole kinship and consent notion of how Daniel Elazar is presenting this as a political reality as opposed to a feature of identity. There's no question in my mind that there's a phenomenon, right, of the discovery of self that most prominently happens, but not exclusively, most prominently happens when a person is othered. It is the ultimate shortcut to an identity, to have your identity stipulated to you by others, and usually through the premise of hate, right? You are other than us, and therefore you have to then go search into your own identity. And there's so many sources on this. Leo Strauss has an incredible line where he says, the Jew is the human being who goes out in search of universal community, and when he gets there, he discovers he's the only one. And it is in that moment that he becomes a Baal Tshuva. Reclaims, Leo Strauss, but it's all rooted in that kind of negative stain of identity. I think that is making a comeback, right? I am a Jew, not because I have consented to being a Jew, but because other people are constructing my identity for me. I don't think that makes community in any sort of meaningful way. What worries me a lot about the euphoria about the surge was that it may have been blurring between two things: people who feel Jewish and people who therefore want to join communities and participate in Jewish life. The short-term euphoria about the surge was marked by communal participation and behavior. I saw it in our shul, I'm sure many of you saw. You had big attendance for the first few weeks following October 7th, record attendance. Hillels showed record attendance for Shabbat dinners in the fall of 2023. By the fall of 2024, they were back at the same pre-October 7th numbers. Does that mean that people, young Jews, older Jews, might not still feel different about their identity post-October 7th? I'm sure they do. So I'm not sure it's a good indicator, it's a good question around how Jewish identity might be changing, but I'm not sure yet it helps us to think about how Jewish community might be changing. And there, I think it is very unlikely for our Jewish community to think of community as the place you inevitably have to go to because you are rejected by others. Welcome back, where have you been? And instead, to think through this notion of consent, how do I construct environments where people are going to continue to want to opt in? Not because we're needy and not because we're desperate, but because I think it's telling something deep about the Jewish condition. Oh.
I'm interested in boundaries, and I was taken by the examples you offered at the beginning on who was in and who was out at that big demonstration and who exactly was a little bit in that fuzzy place. Most boundaries are not very nice, neat boundaries, but the closer you look, they're fuzzy. And you expressed, I think, some positive aspect to the fact that some people might rule themselves out. I recall in two very different contexts on a different matter, hearing a very eloquent analysis by Orthodox poskim that it was the existence of Reform Judaism and of liberal psak that compelled them to be extremely narrow in what they would permit. And they'd say, if you would all go away, we could then, within this model, be far more permissive. And I wondered whether there is not an analogy there. And I wonder in terms of that big tent that you think about, there was a time to give pratim when J Street was absolutely outside the tent and things change. Trua just honored at its dinner Jerry Serrata, whose career was destroyed through Breira, and when he had the chutzpah to imagine that there could be such a thing as a Palestinian state. So I worry about saying we will strengthen and preserve something about Jewish communal integrity by having very tight boundaries and deciding rigidly who is in and who is out.
That's what I've been playing out today. It's exactly that set of questions and concerns. It's exactly the holding in tension, the self-satisfaction that comes when you've actually dealt with the problems on the boundaries versus the pain that comes when you recognize the human relationships that are altered in that process, right? You think of the ultimate Yetzer Hara of the people Israel through the whole second half of the Nevi'im is the inconvenience of the fact that the prophets are a nettle in the side of the people, and they want them to go away. And the thing that the prophets keep doing, which is really an argument for those on the margins of what they have to do, is the prophets insist, despite what could have made their lives much simpler, to stay. Yirmiyahu works this out in his own head. He says over and over, I should give up. I should leave. I should just move out into the wilderness, right? That would make life much easier. I could move to Qumran, I could move to Yavne, I could find my people, and yet Yirmiyahu says, but what am I going to do? God is in my ear, and ultimately the thing that makes the prophets so exceptional, and here I do have an indictment to some degree of those who stand at our community's boundaries attacking the community all the time for its morals. What the prophets are capable of doing is constantly emulating an Ahavat Yisrael in that process. They do not merely love the moral character of the Jewish people, they love the Jewish people. And that dance between loving the people and staying in, and for the people Israel to recognize that they're going to annoy the hell out of you, but I kind of have to be willing to tolerate it, that's the place where we have to figure out that's just the reality of what Jewish life is going to continue to be. Any women? Yes. You did. I know, I'm taking turns. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. I actually want to push back a little bit on Heidi Hurd and the concept of consent. There is out there a very well-developed feminist, critical race, whatever, critique of the concept of consent and who gets to consent and how people are held to their consent. And consent itself can actually, in some cases, be imposed on people and used as a kind of thing that then forces them into certain things. And one classical example that I've worked on is in the area of Jewish marriage, for example, right? So we said, oh, the bride is supposed to consent to the marriage. Of course, she consents only by standing there silently and letting a ring be put on her finger. But then she never gets a chance to revoke her consent again, really, from that marriage in a way that a man gets to. And yet she is presumed, no matter what she says later, he beats me, he's just a nasty person, I don't care for him anymore. Like something has changed. No matter what she says later, that consent is imposed on her, that presumption, even though she may not have come from an equal position to begin with, to consent. And so I just want us to think a little more critically maybe about consent as a useful concept here. I don't necessarily disagree with you that people need consent, and yet at the same time I think we need to think more complexly about the concept of consent.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't use the traditional wedding ceremony as a story of consent. I wouldn't, for exactly the reasons that you're stipulating. I want to read this text, I want to read this more ambitiously about thinking of this as a social model that should be imagined as a norm. That all of our relationships are a constant dance of consent, and that when they turn coercive, right, that's where you see a moral breakdown. And that's true in interpersonal relationships. It's true in legal relationships. When governments impose things on their citizens that take away their will, that is a betrayal of this that should be a kind of normal, maybe call it post-enlightenment story of how human beings are actually allowed to or encouraged to live as independent, autonomous beings. There are going to be, and by the way, hatred and racism and anti-Semitism, going back to the question before, are also betrayals of the notion of consent, because I have the right to both define my own identity as well as membership in particular groups, right, based on my own autonomy, and that is taken away from me, I have something lost. So I don't read this normatively. This is how the world operates. I read it ambitiously. This is how the world could operate, right? And communities that can internalize that notion of consent have a greater possibility of humanizing those who are in their midst. And maybe if more of us see that every time I go to shul, I am consenting to be part of a congregation. If we all see that way, then we see ourselves engaging in the building of something constructive as opposed to what sometimes feels like something somewhat coercive. Yes, okay, what's next? I have one in the back, and then we'll come to these two.
Thank you for pointing out in the story about the Ben Israelit about Vaikov as the verb about puncturing and piercing the veil. I never noticed that, and the only other time I've ever heard that expression is Vaikov Hadina Tahar. And I don't know enough about how that's used. Does that explain or help or anything? Does that add anything to how we think about boundaries and laws?
Amazing. So, yes, so the text is used for, Vayikov Hadina Tahar. I think it's in the Tosefta, there's an incredible articulation which says, Vayikov, it talks about the merits of deen versus other ways of resolving conflict, and it associates deen using that exact pasuk, Vayikov Hadina Tahar, let justice pierce the mountain. It associates that midah with Moshe, and it associates the midah of compromise with Aharon. It's exactly the articulation of this. There is something about Moshe, right? And that's why, by the way, getting Moshe to imagining that Moshe went to apologize to Datan Aviram, or at least to work it out with them, is actually a shtuch on Moshe. He's like the last guy who would do that, right? The rabbis want him to correct this feature, because they ultimately say in that same text in the Tosefta, they start with the premise that to compromise is morally wrong. When you compromise on the holy, you compromise the holy. You don't want to be a people of compromise. And by the end of the text, they get to a place where it's actually a mitzvah to be a person who compromises. And they use that juxtaposition from Moshe to Aaron. The way the philosopher Avishai Margalit describes this text is he says Moses is associated with justice and Aaron is associated with compromise. And in the end, Moses is revered and Aaron is loved. So that's a little bit also of the question here. What kind of leaders do we want to be? Do we want to be the revered leaders who pursue the merits of justice that hold our community intact against those who would fight it? Do we want to be the kinds of leaders who are beloved, who tolerate injustice to some degree in order to try to hold something else together? I think these two are the next two. Go here, right here. Is there a mic? Oh, thanks, Nama.
I want to ask about something that you didn't include in the lecture, and its absence seems to me of importance. We can read the source about the Beit Hashmonai as a fight between two groups of Jews, but we can also read it as a siege on another group, on the Palestinians in Gaza. And we can look at the Tmidim as the sacrifice in the Mikdash, but we can look at it as the humanitarian aid that we ought to put in Gaza, to give Gaza every day. And we can look on the Chazir as a problem of the Jewish halacha, but we can look at the Chazir also as a Chazirut, as an act that shouldn't be done. Shouldn't be done to this degree that the land shooks, not in the realistic matter, but shock in the emotional or ethical level. And I find that the subject of community, of our community, how we define ourselves against against the relation to the other group. This thing is not in discussion enough.
Yeah, I mean, my focus of this talk today obviously relates to issues of Jewish community more than it relates, but I could understand the applicability of reading this text differently. I don't know how exactly I would map that text on the way that you're describing, except to say that I personally believe some number of Israelis and many Palestinians believe that the fates of these people in this land are inextricably tied against one another, and that more is lost through the perpetuation of conflict and the things that we are willing to do to perpetuate conflict, to try to win, as opposed to recognizing that which could be shared. 100%. I think the text lends itself to that kind of possible exploration, even though the reason I took this in the direction that I took it today was because I'm principally focused, as I think are many of the leaders in this room, of thinking about the ramifications of this for those of us who see the conflict that we're dealing with as Jewish right now, as opposed to Jew and the other. But there is no shortage of moral space and opportunity to try to map it even further than the way that I tried to do it. Yes, you had your hand up for a while. To the right. Yeah. Orange.
So I thought I heard you say centrally, community across difference is something we're constantly building. Thought that was the ikar of your presentation, and I'm glad you see that. I feel that I don't. I don't see us building this community here or in the U.S. And it feels to me like you're speaking of philosophy, which is a beautiful philosophy, but we are so far from it. And I'm wondering whether you might be able to name a few agents in this process other than, say, the Hartman Institute. You know, this is so central to the way the Hartman Institute operates here and there. And I'm thinking particularly of groups that have now invented themselves as Jews outside the Jewish community, who are following what they say, these are our eternal Jewish values, and there's no place for us in the community. Who are the people from either side of that boundary who might be seeing each other in the next year or two? Because so far, I'm only seeing movements away from each other, and maybe you're seeing something else.
No. I should be clear. I am not a sociologist, so nothing that I'm talking about is descriptive. I am also not the marketing director for the Hartman Institute, so this is not a plug. I am teaching a philosophy class, that's true, no contest, and I'm offering an invitation. There is the temptations right now for Jewish leaders to think tribally for exactly what you are articulating on what you perceive as on the outside of the community, and for exactly the reasons that those who are on the outside of the community perceive about you and our community and our leadership as a place that is inattentive to their moral feelings and concerns, is rooted in a closedness that they don't find a way in. All of that sounds like it is rooted in far more certainty and irreconcilability than it actually may be. Learned something very powerful years ago when Stephanie and I, together with a few friends, were involved in starting a new congregation. We started a new congregation. There were 6 of us around the table to organize it. We said we're going to start Parshat B'Shalach in 2006, 2005, and we counted how many people were going to come. We needed 10, so it was like, okay, it's us 6. I know that person's coming. These 2 people are coming. We'll divide up the laning. We rented a space, and 75 people showed up. We didn't even know where they were and where they come from. None of us among the organizers knew each other particularly well. We had come together as kind of a matter of convenience because we all wanted to have a new congregation. At that first Shabbat, multiple people said, well, I really liked coming here, but I feel very uncomfortable because everybody here knows each other. And that was a powerful lesson to me because obviously there are feelings of exclusion that happen. If you've ever moved to a new community, you walk in the room and you're like, oh my God, there's insiders and there's outsiders, and I'm the outsider. But I learned from that experience that instinct of thinking that there's some impermeable line between the insiders and the outsiders is an instinct and not always a description of an empirical reality. Everybody was an outsider, but we have almost a biological instinct to feel that we're not insiders until we're insiders. And I use that to say, you could look at what's going on in Jewish communal life today as the re-articulation of incredibly clear boundaries between those who are parading on the outside and those of us who are here on the inside. But I would suggest that many of us who are on the inside hold deep, painful ambivalences about the things that we are meant to believe and that constitute communal ideas and communal norms. That many people on the outside are desperate to be on the inside. That many of us hold institutional loyalties that are imperfect renderings of our complex personal and moral feelings. And then I would say, those who are leaders on the inside, who can humanize all of that difference, bear a special responsibility, not the Hartman Institute, bear a special responsibility to be the kinds of leaders who can help bridge the difference between those individuals who feel on the outside and those who feel on the inside. This is not presenting what are the organizations that are resisting some story of what's taking place in the world. It's not going to happen through organizations. It's going to happen by the construction of communities that allow people to participate and to consent. It will happen through the rendering of community as a entity that is fundamentally forged by some amount of humility. It will come through leaders who do not see their responsibility as a zealous patrolling of the boundaries, but by the individuals who enable us to build something better than what seems like the inevitability of the political moment that we're in. Julie, yeah.
Julie Roth from Montclair, New Jersey. My question for you is, what would you say is the top 10 list of dividing issues right now within the Jewish community, and even obvious ones, and which ones of those are more dangerous communally because of the fractures that they provide in the communal landscape, and what factors make them more dangerous?
Can I pick just 3?
You can do whatever you want.
Yeah. No, I want to say 3 only because like 4 through 10, it's a little bit like 1, 2, 3, and then 4 through 10. Like 9 might be kitniot, but nobody cares, right? Israel, anti-Semitism, Trump. That's kind of it, right? You want to say Trump, you want to say domestic partisan politics. The interesting things about all 3 of these is that they are massive social forces that in some ways don't fully originate out of Judaism and are about what it means to be kind of Jewishly, politically in the world. And there's a lot we could say about this, but since the end of the 19th century, and the perception by Jews that in order to be differently in the world, we were going to have to play different politics than we ever had, the claiming of a sense of agency by Jews in our politics. Since that time, the principal theater of Jewish life is political. That is where our central debates play out. It is the issues that divide the Jewish community more than any others. How I would dream of a Jewish community that was engaged in theological disputes. How awesome would that be? But they're not. They're effectively political conditions that we face, political circumstances, some and others that feel beyond our control, questions of agency in terms of who Jews are going to be politically, who are our allies, who are our enemies, our responsibility to shape the societies in which we're in. And I fear that because that's the case, what we do then is mirror the political dynamics around us. America is an overwhelmingly partisan place right now. Partisanship is the strongest characteristic of our politics. American Jews have not overwhelmingly decided, as I wish they would, that partisanship itself is a threat to Jews. We instead do what other Americans do, which is you try to win. In that political context, it's eroding our capacity to fight anti-Semitism as a collective concern. It's eroding our capacity to think of Israel as an expression of Jewishness rather than a mirror of our politics. It's doing all of those things. And unless we were able to find a way to recapture that these should be things that we hold together, as opposed to simply being players in the same type of social divisions that other people are experiencing, that's why these conflicts feel so irreconcilable to us. You're going to need to believe in something bigger in order to be able to tolerate the amount of conflict that we have over these issues. I'm going to take a last one from Aaron behind you. Yeah.
Just to go back to the text a little bit, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Batera, one of the things I heard you talking about was that the rabbis essentially are trying to make sure we don't give up on people. That when boundaries are established, that's, as you said, violent and painful. And that it made me think of, and especially in Rabbi Yehuda ben Batera's comment about tshuva, and about like the notion of that like nobody is ever fully, or very rarely outside of the camp. And there's lots to say about Hashavat Aveda and kind of, thoughts about that. But I guess I'm curious, what does that mean in terms of our community? And what does it say in terms of like our participation? I guess I would love to hear kind of your thoughts about that and to what extent we are responsible for or participating in people's tshuva or keeping people in on some level, either as leaders or as community participants.
Yeah. I know and I feel the extent of these political conflicts in our Jewish community as much as anybody. I know it and I feel it, I live with it. And yet I am just convinced that it is not that the norms created or demanded by political conflict should not be the ones that shape what it means to be a religious, spiritual, and moral leader of the Jewish people. That we are taking the bait too much. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. It's where power and philanthropy seem to be located in the Jewish community. It's where people pay attention, right? We know, like, the sermon that will go viral is probably not the one about the korbanot, right? But I don't think it's the work. So when I listen to these texts, I want us to elevate them because they are guidance for us to think about what religious, moral, spiritual leadership could look like for a Jewish community in a divided time, and for Jewish leaders who are trying to hold together community, as opposed to simply trying to win on a set of political issues through different entities in the Jewish community. And a lot of this is just personal and even musardik. I have personal relationships that I've lost in the past 2 years. I'm sure some of you have as well. Sometimes you have to tolerate that because you think that you are right and someone is wrong. And it's a very satisfying feeling to feel that you are right and others unjust. And I read this text and I say, maybe there will be a time in my life when I'm supposed to hear the Torah of Moshe going to Datan and Aviram. By the way, text doesn't say that Datan and Aviram were right. They're still Datan and Aviram. Moshe is still Moshe. You get to still feel righteous if you apply that text to yourself. And maybe you can't do it any day. But when it becomes the kind of template of a Torah which says that that's kind of who we're supposed to be, that we're supposed to confront the story of Korach and say no, doesn't work. That works in God's world. It doesn't work in our human world. It's an invitation to think about what moral, religious, and spiritual leadership could look like even in such a divided time. Thank you, everybody.